Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for How to Fall Asleep and Stay Asleep. This webinar series is brought to you by Can Do Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Krista Sipp, Associate Director of Programs and Implementation here at Can Do MS, and tonight I will be your moderator. So a few housekeeping items. We will save about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. If you have a question during the presentation, you can type it in using the questions chat box found in your control panel. This presentation will be recorded and we will archive it on the Can Do MS website so that you can view it later. We'll send a follow-up email tomorrow with that archive, as well as the presentation slides and an accompanying library article. You can also download a copy of tonight's presentation, additional resources in your control panel and go to webinar this evening. And even though tonight is one program on sleep, we do have a couple other programs to check out this month. So October is our sleep month. We're going to be focusing on sleep. October 13th, we have Get Started with Better Sleep at our Jumpstart program. Then we have another Q&A session October 18th, and Sam is also going to be joining us for that one, tonight's guest speaker. And that one will be on sleep and MS as well. Both of those programs will be hosted on Zoom. Then starting October 12th, we're going to do a 4-week coaching series on fatigue. So you can also find that on our website, cando-ms.org, where you can register for all those programs. And without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker this evening, Samantha Domingo, who is a psychologist in Corvallis, Oregon. And she also specializes in behavioral sleep medicine. So she's going to be our guru this evening and lead us on our presentation and our journey to learn more about sleep. So welcome, Sam.
Thank you.
And I will go ahead and pass the torch on to you for tonight.
All right, thank you so much, Krista. I'm really excited to be here tonight talking about one of my favorite topics. So these are some of the learning objectives for tonight. We're going to learn about common sleep problems in MS. We'll talk a little bit about strategies and tools that you can start that can be used to assess a person's sleep. And then we can talk a little bit about strategies that we can implement to manage common sleep problems. So before we get going with our talk tonight, we have a little bit of a poll. So I'd like to know who's in the audience tonight, if you are a person living with MS, a support partner, or maybe a healthcare professional. And you can click on the screen. All right. So it looks like the majority are people living with MS. So great. That's good to know. That will help me tailor the presentation a little bit more. So sleep and MS. So we know that sleep difficulties, as you've probably experienced, are very common in people with MS. And this is really including all sorts of sleep disorders, which we'll get into in just a little bit. We know that there's estimates of about 48 or 50% to 68% prevalence, which is 4 times more than in the general population. And there's lots of reasons for that, which again, we'll get into. One of the most common sleep problems is insomnia. And in general, sleep is something that tends to be overlooked, partly because there's a lot of other things that need to be managed. But this is one that can really impact emotional and actual physical well-being. So it can impact the way that you feel during the day. It can impact mood, it can impact energy, it can impact pain. There's lots and lots of different things that are regulated and can be helped by sleep. So when it comes to your sleep, tell me a little bit about what are some of your specific difficulties. Are you having trouble falling asleep initially, staying asleep, feeling sleepy during the day no matter how much sleep you get? Or do you already have one or more diagnosed sleep disorders? We'll take a minute to wait on the results. Okay, so it looks like difficulty staying asleep and then feeling sleepy during the day, no matter how much sleep you get. So I'll be sure to spend extra time talking about those and things that we can do to help manage that. All right, so when it comes to sleep and sleep problems in MS, it's pretty complicated. So typically, we think of sleep as, oh, I just have to meditate more. I have to go to bed on time. When really those things can help, but there's multiple causes that can cause sleep issues and different types of sleep difficulties. So there's some structural things, some physiological things that are involved in sleep that can be affected by the disease itself. So all of our sleep is regulated in our brain. And as we know, MS is something that attacks our central nervous system, our brain and spinal cord and optic nerves. So when there are lesions in these brain structures, like the hypothalamus, specifically an area called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, I know, say that 3 times. That part of the brain regulates our wake and sleep cycles. And if there are lesions there, it can lead to problems down the line. We also notice changes in neurotransmitters that are involved in sleep. So these are chemicals that act as messengers, right, that send that information through your brain cells. There's also a possibility that vitamin D deficiency can lead to sleep difficulties. We also know that symptoms of MS in general can be pretty disruptive to sleep. For example, pain, urinary bowel symptoms, fatigue, especially. So it would be important to manage these as best as possible so that they're causing the least disruption in sleep. We also know that certain behaviors and habits can impact our ability to sleep well, right? So, things like, for example, sleep hygiene is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but essentially, what are some of the behaviors that are impacting your sleep? Is it, drinking too much caffeine during the day? Is it, certain habits like showering really late at night with really hot water, or eating late at night, or staying in bed when we're not sleeping can actually be counterproductive. So we'll talk a little bit more about what those specific habits and behaviors are in just a few minutes, but just knowing that that can also have an effect on our sleep. And then, of course, depression, anxiety, and stress. Those are the things we typically think of when we have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, right? Being worried about something that may be going on in your life, or having a mental health diagnosis like depression or anxiety, where there's a lot of worry or just inability to sleep. What's really cool is that when we address sleep issues, we see differences in terms of outcomes when it comes to mood and depression management and anxiety. So the better your sleep is, the better you'd be able to manage your mood in addition to pain and other symptoms. All right, so we talked about sleep problems, sleep disturbance. What exactly do we mean? There's a whole host of variety of sleep problems and sleep disorders. So, for example, we talked about insomnia. So that's difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, despite having adequate opportunity to sleep. There's sleeping too much, which is more like a hypersomnolence disorder or hypersomnia. There are people who experience uncontrollable lapses into sleep or sleepy attacks, where people have no control over when and where they fall asleep, and that's known as narcolepsy. There's sleep-related breathing difficulties like sleep apnea that can get in the way of restful sleep. And then there's excessive daytime sleepiness, which sometimes can go hand in hand with sleep-related breathing difficulties or sleep apnea. And lastly, abnormal movements and or behavior that happens during sleep. So for instance, restless leg syndrome, which also is more, it happens more in people with MS. So we'll go into a few of these, but in general, these problems we know can lead to impairment in one or more areas of functioning or one or more areas in your life. So I'm curious, our next polling question will ask you to describe the areas of your life which are most impacted by your sleep problems. So mood, family and relationships, work, cognitive functioning, MS symptoms. And we'll wait for those results to come in. Here we go. So cognitive functioning, symptoms, and mood are some of the areas that are more largely impacted by your sleep problems. So we'll get to talk about those too. All right. So the first step before we try any intervention is really assessing, right? Some people have more than one sleep disorder, so it's important to know exactly what's going on before we go ahead and think about treatments. So if any of the problems that I mentioned before, either the difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, sleeping too much, feeling sleepy during the day, if any of those sound familiar to you, it's really important to bring them up to your healthcare team. Sleep is not always routinely assessed, so it's something that you may have to talk directly with your provider about, whether it's your neurologist or your primary care provider. They might consider a referral to a sleep medicine specialist, and these are either physicians, nurse practitioners, and other disciplines, other areas that focus specifically on sleep. So they basically will do a thorough clinical interview of your symptoms, when your sleep problems started, the quality of your sleep problems. So sometimes if you're having trouble remembering exactly what you're going through and on a day-to-day basis, it's really helpful to sometimes write down some of the specific symptoms you're having, so that then you can bring them up to the sleep medicine specialist if that's something that ends up being part of your plan. Sometimes you'll be referred for a sleep study, which is polysomnography or hum sleep test, which basically means that you will be monitored overnight to look at all kinds of different measures. So they tend to look at things like oxygen levels and heart rate. They also look at your brain waves through EEG, which is how we measure when someone is asleep. They look at all sorts of other things to help evaluate whether you have a sleep disorder, like, for example, sleep apnea. The second type of sleep study that I have listed here is a multiple sleep latency test. And that's typically reserved for people whose regular sleep study in the lab demonstrates that the person might be at risk for something like narcolepsy. So what this second study does is it has the person take naps after a full night of sleep. I know it sounds pretty great. They'll have them take naps every so often, and they'll measure how quickly they can fall asleep. So there's a certain parameter where if people fall asleep within a certain amount of time, multiple times throughout the test, then it means that they have narcolepsy. I didn't get to talk about the home sleep test, but some people do qualify for a home sleep test, which is sometimes easier to do if you have trouble sleeping in a lab or if you have any kind of insomnia, as long as you don't have any major other comorbidities, meaning other medical conditions like heart disease or things like that, that would not make the home test very useful. So those are the tools that we have kind of available as far as, measurable objective tools in addition to the clinical interview. And because there's so many sleep disorders, I'm going to focus in on the ones that are most common, particularly with MS. So we'll start with insomnia. There we go. So insomnia can be classified into acute or chronic. Acute insomnia, I think we've all had that experience at some point in our lives when something happens, either a medical event or new stressor, a loss, change of job, any major life transition can sometimes bring a period of insomnia where we're having difficulty falling asleep, we wake up multiple times during the night, or all of the above. Typically, it tends to resolve within a few weeks, right? You go back to your regular sleeping patterns, whatever they were. So in terms of treatment, sometimes it resolves on its own, and sometimes it can be helped by medications in the short term. With chronic insomnia, this is when people experience either difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, overall poor quality sleep, more than 3 nights per week for over a period of 3 months. And it causes some sort of daytime consequence. So either difficulties with work or relationships or problems with mood or cognition, as a lot of you have related to. And it's something that can be treated. So we'll talk about treatment for insomnia in a few minutes, but just knowing that in terms of levels of treatment, acute insomnia may not need treatment. Chronic insomnia definitely does. So if these are things that you experience, it's definitely important to bring them up to your healthcare team. So this is a neat little tool that we use in sleep medicine to essentially evaluate insomnia. So all of these symptoms map out with the criteria for a diagnosis of chronic insomnia. So you would basically rate your symptoms from mild, from none to very severe. And then it asks you to describe how satisfied you are with your sleep pattern, how noticeable you think your problems are, how worried you are about them, and how they interfere. So this is a very useful tool that your provider may use to evaluate the severity of your insomnia. And we can use this as well to evaluate whether treatment is working. Another great tool that we have at our disposal are sleep diaries. So some of you may be familiar already with this type of tool, but essentially it allows you to keep data on your sleep. Basically, your perception of your sleep at any given night. So usually we'll have people complete these over a period of 2 weeks or at least 1 week. And it has you basically input this information that's on the screen. So what time did you get into bed? What time did you try to fall asleep? How long did it take you to fall asleep? How many times did you wake up? How long were you up for in the middle of the night? What time you were up for the day? And what time you got out of bed. And then it has you rating the quality of your sleep. So when I introduce this to patients, I will often let them know that it's important to do this not in the middle of the night. It's not super relevant to be 100% accurate with these, but rather kind of an estimation of the previous night. So this will help us look at patterns. It will help us evaluate progress in treatment. It will give us a clue as to what may be going on in terms of perhaps other sleep disorders, especially if it's a sleep diary that goes over 24 hours. So in general, this is a very, very useful tool. Sometimes people will ask, and we can go to the next slide when you're ready. Why can I just use my Fitbit or my Apple Watch or any other tracking device or app? And the main reason is that it's less reliable in people who experience fragmented sleep and insomnia. So it may be overestimated the severity of the problem or underestimating it. And so sometimes that can actually help less than we would want, because then we start to increase that anxiety about sleep, right? Like my sleep tracker says that I woke up 50 times last night. And so that already puts you in a place where you're going to be worried about the night before. And then that can definitely impact your ability to fall asleep and stay asleep. So just a note on that. I know many people own these activity trackers and they can certainly be useful. But when we compare actigraphy, which is the standard for research studies, and it's something that you wear on your wrist, just like these trackers, those are lab grade level trackers. They don't really compare. So either actigraphy watch or sleep diaries are thought to be the most helpful and most reliable tool when it comes to sleep management. All right, so we'll get into what is sleep apnea. So sleep apnea occurs when there are brief episodes when you essentially stop breathing. And whether that's because there's an obstruction in your airway or lesions in the brain that are causing this, your brain automatically usually will wake you up, right? And these awakenings, we call them arousals or microarousals, where basically you're not really aware that you're awake, but it certainly takes you out of that deep sleep. And this can happen multiple times per hour, which means multiple times per night. Which means that if you're getting 8 hours of sleep, but you're waking up or having these arousals, anywhere from 6 times to, I think one of the worst cases I've seen was like 120 times, doesn't matter that you got 8 hours of sleep or 10 hours of sleep, you're still going to be tired because you're not getting that full, deep, restful quality sleep that you would otherwise. So a lot of times there are some telltale signs that it might be worthwhile to see if you might have sleep apnea. So things like snoring, for example, and this is something that partners can observe, although the people experiencing these can certainly wake up either with a dry mouth or gasping for air, or waking up several times per night. Some people report morning headaches, and that can be related to the drops of oxygen levels. So in general, this is something that definitely needs to be treated, and we have very effective treatments. So through CPAP or BiPAP, essentially PAP therapies that help remove either the obstruction, keep the airway open, or do that sort of control breathing for you. So it works 100% of the time, and treating sleep apnea can help prevent a lot of different risks in terms of health. So it can impact your heart, your cardiovascular health, it can impact your cognitive functioning, it can impact your mood, it can impact your ability to regulate glucose. So if you have any sort of problems like diabetes, it can certainly affect it. So it's something that we definitely want to get checked out if you have any of the risk factors. Like, it tends to be more common in males. It tends to be more common in people who are overweight, although that's not always the case. Snoring can be a sign of it, and daytime sleepiness. So if you have a lot of daytime sleepiness and you're falling asleep while doing things, this could also be a sign of sleep apnea. So this is why it's really important to have a sleep medicine specialist look at this, because there's a lot of overlap with these sleep disorders. So we talked about a sleep study before, and this is essentially what it looks like. So you have all of these little measures. You have the electrodes monitoring your brain activity. You have belt monitors monitoring your breathing, muscle movements to evaluate for things like restless leg syndrome, which we'll talk about in a minute. The microphone can record snoring. So if you've done a sleep study, this is probably very familiar to you, just being connected to all of these different things that are giving tons of information and can help rule out and differentiate between sleep disorders. So restless legs is the last sleep disorder I wanted to touch on tonight. It's different from spasms or spasticity and different from tremors. It typically causes voluntary movement as a way to relieve some of the discomfort. So this is not just experienced in the legs, although that's kind of, the name is a little bit of a misnomer. Some people experience it in their trunk or other parts of the body. So essentially it feels like having a creepy, crawly, feely sensation inside of your legs, for example, that only gets alleviated with movement or getting out of bed and moving around. So that's what makes it different from paresthesias or other MS-related symptoms. So if movement relieves some of that pressure, or not pressure, but discomfort, it might be a sign that it could be related to restless legs. Sometimes being low in iron can cause this, or being dehydrated can sometimes influence it, but it's definitely something that needs to be treated, and typically with medication. Okay. So here are the strategies. So some of the tools that can be implemented. So as I mentioned before, consulting your healthcare team. So if any of the things we talked about tonight sound familiar to you and you haven't been evaluated for any sleep issues, it would be important to bring this up. And perhaps requesting or asking your provider for an evaluation by a sleep medicine specialist. So you may need to have a sleep study to rule out all of these different causes. So beyond insomnia, things like sleep apnea, restless legs, narcolepsy. And like I mentioned, many people with MS can have more than one type of sleep disturbance. For example, insomnia can be really common in people with sleep apnea. And part of that is the frequent awakenings during the night create this pattern of inability to fall back asleep. So sometimes we want to make sure that we're treating both, either one at a time or both at the same time. So the big question, how to fall asleep and stay asleep like this beautiful, cozy kitten. So it's always best to go at it from different angles. So a multidisciplinary approach is best. So you want to make sure that you have your MS team helping you with symptom management, evaluating your current medications, which sometimes can aggravate sleep difficulties, medical equipment, like we talked about the CPAP or BiPAP machine to help with managing things like sleep apnea. And then where I come in really is the behavioral aspects of sleep medicine. So there's different types of treatments for example, for insomnia. Behavioral sleep medicine focuses on managing the behaviors, the beliefs, and the emotional aspects of dealing with a sleep disorder. So for example, for insomnia, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia specifically is now the standard recommended first line of treatment for chronic insomnia. We know that it's effective in about 80% of the population that tries this treatment. We also know that it can be also useful for people with MS. There's lots of new and exciting research being done that demonstrates that it's effective for people with MS. It's a short-term treatment, so typically 4 to 6 sessions before people start noticing results. And it's something that can be done virtually. So you don't necessarily need to see someone like me in person, but really it can be done online. So we know that it works. So that's one aspect of behavioral sleep medicine. There are others. So for instance, some people have difficulty adjusting to their CPAP, either because they have anxiety about it, or they just have other things that get in the way of using it. So someone like me or a sleep psychologist might come in and strategize and figure out ways to help with either relaxation training or addressing the anxiety, or perhaps even PTSD that can get in the way of adhering to this treatment. So that's kind of the gamut of who can help with these. In terms of strategies, as I mentioned before, we often hear of sleep hygiene, and I hear this from patients when I work with them. They'll say, you know, I have the best sleep hygiene and I still have insomnia. Well, of course, because sleep hygiene is necessary, but it's not going to fix your sleep problems, right? If you don't have good sleep hygiene, it definitely can affect sleep, but it's not the only thing that's going to fix your sleep. So one of the best ways that you can help regulate your sleep-wake cycles is to have a regular schedule. And more important than having a regular bedtime is to have a regular wake time, regardless of the kind of night that you had the night before. So this is where those behaviors, right, that impact our sleep cycles come in. It can affect our circadian rhythm, right, which is our internal clock. And it can essentially put us in an artificial state of jet lag if we have different bedtimes and wake times every day. So it's really important that as much as possible, unless you work, a night shift or shift schedule, that you maintain the same schedule every day. The regular wake up will help reset your clock every morning. And it will help build up that sleep pressure or sleepiness over the day so that it's more likely that you will fall asleep at night. Another strategy is going to bed only when you're sleepy. This is why I mentioned that sometimes the bedtime doesn't necessarily have to be a strict bedtime, especially if you don't feel sleepy. And differentiating sleepy from tired or fatigued, which can be hard. But sleepy is essentially that, noticing the physical aspects of it. Are your eyes really heavy? You can't keep your eyes open kind of feeling, like body temperature dropping. Those are cues that you're sleepy. So that's when it's recommended that you go into bed. Getting out of bed when you're not able to sleep with some exceptions. This is a great strategy for helping us rebuild our relationship with our bed, right? Oftentimes when we have insomnia or there's sleep problems and we spend a lot of time in bed not sleeping, our brain starts to associate the bed with wakefulness, or the bed with frustration or some other activity. So when possible, unless there's mobility or balance issues, getting out of bed and going, if it's accessible or available to you, into a different room or perhaps a different part of the room, and doing something else that's relaxing or boring that will allow you to get sleepy again, and then going back to bed and trying again. So typically the guideline is, waiting 15, 20 minutes. If you can't fall asleep, getting out of bed. I would advise not looking at the clock, so just kind of guesstimating how long it's been, because when we look at the clock, we start to put more pressure on ourselves, right, to sleep, and so that definitely doesn't help. So that's one strategy. Another one that ties into it is using the bed only for sleeping, or the 3 S's. So sleep, when you're sick, and when you're having sexual activity. If you're using the bed for work or other things, it can create that association of the bed or sleeping environment with activity, which then your brain kind of learns to associate with it. Being strategic with naps. So for fatigue management, it's oftentimes helpful to have short naps, either 1 nap or 2 naps, or, depending on the person and the specifics that they're dealing with, but sometimes naps can be helpful, as long as you're keeping them under 30 minutes, right? If we sleep longer than 30 minutes, we start getting into deeper sleep, which, if you happen to ever wake up from a 2-hour nap wondering where you are or what day it is, it's because you're waking up from a really deep stage of sleep, which in turn can make you feel groggy. So grogginess is not going to help fatigue, and it's not going to help your sleep that night. And with napping, you also want to time them with the times of day. You definitely don't want to take a nap in the evening, because that's too close to bedtime. Probably, like, the latest I sometimes tell patients who have regular schedules, like, daytime schedules, is usually no later than 2 p.m., because then we start getting into that zone where it's not, naps actually keep us from having good sleep. Creating a buffer zone or quiet time before bed can be helpful. So having a set routine that doesn't involve screens or anything like that, or work or watching the news. So having a time, even if it's 30 minutes, 20 minutes of disconnecting from your day for a little bit and doing something that's quiet, either reading or stretching or, any sort of other routine that you find soothing and comforting, putting on your PJs, etc. And then avoiding planning or worrying in bed. So this goes back to getting out of bed if you're unable to sleep, or only using the bed for sleeping. We definitely don't want to create that association. So sometimes setting up specific worry time, not in the nighttime, can help minimize that happening in the middle of the night. And I know I want to leave some time for questions, so we'll move over to the next slide, please. We talked about turning the clock around. That just creates unnecessary pressure. Limiting caffeine, which can be difficult sometimes if you're dealing with fatigue, right? And a lot of the medications that are prescribed for fatigue can be stimulants, so it can be kind of difficult to time these, but as much as it's possible, limiting the use of caffeine or other stimulants. Limiting alcohol. Alcohol can be very helpful in helping us fall asleep. I know this can be taken out of context, but it's not very good at helping us stay asleep, and it's not good at helping us have good quality sleep because of the way that alcohol metabolizes. So it can help us initially fall asleep, but it will definitely make us have fragmented, unrestful sleep. Exercise is great, but not too close to bedtime. We definitely want to keep our body temperature down before bed, because higher temperatures tend to let your body know that it's not time for sleep. And of course, environmental things like keeping your bedroom quiet, dark, cool, noticing how old your mattress is. So if you have like a 15, 20-year-old mattress, might be time to change it. Avoiding heavy meals prior to bedtime. And then one really important one, especially as we head into fall and winter and daytime gets less and less available, exposing yourself to sunlight first thing in the morning can help reinforce your natural circadian rhythm or your internal clock. So doing that in the morning and then avoiding electronics in the evening can help your circadian rhythm basically run on its own. Sometimes these artificial lights or blue lights can impact our brain in a way that it basically confuses it. And we look at computers or phones when we're trying to sleep. Not only is it activating in terms of, you're kind of getting your mind going, but it's also physically can impact that area of our brain that we talked about that regulates our sleep-wake cycles. So we definitely don't want to do that. We don't want to confuse our circadian rhythm. And then I wanted to bring up some great resources. I realized that 40 minutes is definitely not enough to talk about this topic. But as Krista said, there's more to come the rest of the month. So I invite you all to participate. And these are some other great resources that you can utilize for more information than what I was able to provide tonight.
Yep, absolutely. And in the PDF version of this that's in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar portal, you'd be able to click on these links. We'll also share these in the follow-up email. You can access those in the presentation slides in the follow-up email tomorrow around this time. There were a couple of references that Sam listed. And then we want to jump into Q&A time. So we saved some time at the end of this webinar to answer your questions. Real quick though, as a reminder first, at the end of the webinar, we will have a survey pop up. We'd love to have you take that survey at the conclusion of the webinar to provide us your feedback and let us know what you thought. But again, first, let's get some questions done. So let me pause my screen share here. And I've highlighted a few questions that we can look at. So one, we got a number of questions about sleep aids. So if you're trying not to take sleep aids, is there one habit that you can adopt that would help your body sleep more on its own? Is there like one thing that you would highly recommend?
That's such a good question. Well, we know that in general, sleep aids are not a very good solution for the long term. They might help, in the short term, especially if you have like that kind of stress-induced insomnia. But it can, it can be habit forming. It can have consequences down the road, especially, with cognition and things like that. So if there's like one thing I would tell people, or actually two things. One is really keeping that wake time the same every day of the week, if possible. And I know that sounds terrible. If you work or, if you tend to sleep in on days that you're off. But that's really one of the keys to help reset your internal clock every morning. And the other part is getting out of bed when you're not sleeping, right? So those strategies can help us build enough sleep pressure or sleepiness throughout the night, throughout the day, that it will make it more likely for you to fall asleep at the beginning of your next night, right? So essentially you're kind of like, if let's say that you go to bed at 11, can't fall asleep, you end up getting like 4 hours of sleep, you still would want to wake up at the same time that you normally wake up. So let's say that that is 6 o'clock in the morning. You're going to go your whole day and try your hardest not to nap, because what you're doing is building that sleep pressure, which will act as like a natural sleep aid the night before, as long as you're not going to bed earlier than your regular bedtime. So I know that sounds complex, but it's not. It's just, it sounds simple, but it's kind of hard to do, right? So maintaining the regular wake time will help you build enough sleep drive the rest of the day, so that you can have a better chance at falling asleep naturally that night. So
sounds like consistency.
it might mean, yes. So consistency is your circadian rhythm's best friend. And the more that we can help regulate that, the more successful we can be with falling asleep at night. So all of that to say, that's not the one, like, it might not fix everything for you, but that consistency can help prevent the habits that disrupt our sleep. So I'm guilty of doing this sometimes. If I have a bad night of sleep, maybe going to bed earlier the next day, and then experiencing insomnia again. So it's kind of like a cycle. So this regular wake time helps reset that pattern every morning.
That makes sense. So we've gotten a few interesting and kind of cool questions in the chat that I wanted to address, and I think they're kind of in the same category. So I'll ask a couple of them and then hand it to you. Someone said they often listen to podcasts to lull themselves to sleep, but they're wondering if this is counterproductive. Like, if you're waking up still tired, could that be counterproductive? And then to kind of piggyback on that one, a couple other people also said that they'll read a book before bedtime to help them fall asleep. If they wake up in the middle of the night, they might pick the book up again. Any thoughts on that? Podcast, books before bed, or if you wake up in the middle of the night?
Yeah.
Thoughts there?
So my thoughts are that if they're helping you lull yourself into sleep, do it. Do not stop your podcast. Like, as long as you're avoiding a lot of screen usage, if reading helps you fall asleep, awesome. Keep that up. What I would be mindful of is the content of the podcast or the book. If it's like an exciting book and it's a page turner, sometimes it can be like the Netflix phenomenon, or like, oh, one more episode or one more chapter, and that can keep us awake. And then it can be tough to fall asleep, and then we're tired the next day. With podcasts, I think keeping the topics boring, probably not something that you're super interested in, so that you can actually fall asleep. I know some of my patients love like the apps that have sleep stories. You have this like amazing like voice just reading you a bedtime story, and that can help them fall asleep. So if it's helping, keep it up.
Yeah. I know I've seen some podcasts or the sleep stories too, where you can set a timer as well, so it'll automatically shut off, so that way you don't have to pick your device back up to turn the podcast or whatever it is off. So I think that could probably be good as well. Assuming maybe.
Yeah, and if you wear AirPods like me, like maybe not using those, because then it can be uncomfortable and might wake you up at night if you have them in your ear. Probably not good. But they actually sell like these really cool like eye masks that have
headphones or pod holders.
Yeah. So it can you can sleep on them and they don't like dig into your ear.
Love that. That's awesome. So kind of jumping around, we also got a question about supplements and or diet considerations. Anything in that realm that could help you get a more restful night of sleep?
So this is definitely outside of my area of expertise. I'm not a dietitian, but we know that in general, Eating regular meals during the day as a way to maintain good, healthy, stable glucose levels can help with sleep. Again, avoiding very heavy meals right before bed. So allowing yourself to maybe have like 2 hours, 3 hours of digestion time before you get into bed, because when you think about the mechanics of digesting food, we're like laying down, so it's harder for food to move through the digestive tract. So that can keep you up. It's not fun. And in terms of specific supplements, we know that too much vitamin D, and this is relevant for people with MS, too much vitamin D can actually impact our sleep in negative ways. So making sure that you're not overdoing it with the supplements. Again, supplements are, it's something that can be so unregulated that we don't know exactly like the formulations some of these supplements offer. Like some people will take melatonin or GABA or things like that. And I suggest always consulting with a physician before even trying any supplements, because we know that melatonin is something that can actually not help if it's overused, right? And it can cause more problems than not. Same with GABA, especially if you're taking other medications that affect brain pathways, which most of them do. You may, that's something to check on to make sure that they don't have those side effects. So yeah, anything like that's high sugar at night, probably want to stay away from in terms of specific foods. But yeah, generally good nutrition, stable blood glucose control, things like that can be helpful.
Awesome, thank you. Now, what about brain chatter? Getting brain chatter in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
I know I've been there. I'm sure we've all been
Good
there.
old brain chatter.
Anything you can do to shut that off?
Well, I think that the main thing is adjusting our expectations about shutting it off, because the reality is that our brains don't really shut off, right? So I think releasing that, letting go of that pressure of like, I need to have a blank mind to fall asleep. That's not necessarily true, right? So what I think can be helpful is to do some of that processing of information like earlier in the evening, right? I think what happens a lot of the time is that we get so distracted or so busy in our days that we don't necessarily have the time to sit down and reflect and plan, or think about what happened or things like that. So a lot of what happens is your brain is having this amazing opportunity where it's quiet, nobody needs you, and you have time, and it likes to think. That's what your brain does, right? So a way to kind of prevent that from going overboard and going down a rabbit hole of, oh, I gotta make sure I water the plant tomorrow, or the most random thoughts will pop in our minds like in the middle of the night. So doing that earlier in the evening and doing what I call, like I think I mentioned it in the webinar, scheduled worry time. It's an intentional, like set time. I would say 15, no more than 20 minutes, where you set a timer and you allow yourself to write down all of the things that are going through your mind, whether that's problems that are going on or stressors or things that you need to be doing, to-do lists, plans for the next day, doing that earlier in the evening. So that when the brain chatter does come up, you can tell yourself like, oh, okay, brain, like, thank you. I already worried about that earlier and we have a solution and I wrote it down and I won't forget. If it happens again, you can keep the list next to your, on your nightstand, and you can kind of write things down if, something's keeping you up. There's also things like meditation, which can help us focus our attention. It's might not, it's not gonna, unless you are a very avid meditator, I don't think it's gonna keep your mind free from thought. So it will help you build that muscle to redirect your attention. So rather than getting caught up in thinking or thoughts, we focus on other sensations like deep breathing or, you know, counting sheep. I think that's where that comes from. It's really like focusing our attention on something other than getting caught in our thoughts.
Yeah. Awesome. Another one that came through the chat this evening, sleep positioning. The position you sleep in, etc., does that have an impact on quality of sleep? We haven't really talked about
it. Depends. It depends. So there's a lot of factors, right? So the example that comes to mind is people who have digestive problems. And this is very recent because I was pregnant not too long ago, is the reflux that can happen during certain positions when you're trying to sleep, where people who have GERD and things like that. So sleeping on your left side can help basically mechanically, the way that your stomach lays, it makes it harder for that reflux to come up when you're on your left side. Positioning can be really important too for people who have things like sleep apnea. Sometimes people have more of these breathing events when they're on their backs. So sometimes it can go from like you're sleeping on your back, you have sleep apnea, to you're sleeping on your side and you no longer have sleep apnea. So they do sell like positional pillows that keep you from rolling over and sleeping on your back. Other things to consider are things like pain or spasticity. So it might wake you up in the middle of the night so that you can shift positions to kind of adjust and get more comfortable. So really, I think if there's a position that you like, I think as long as you don't have sleep apnea and it's not being on your back, it doesn't really hurt all that much.
Awesome.
But really making sure that it's a comfortable position is really the main thing.
Okay, so last question. Do people with MS need more sleep than other people?
Ooh, that's a great question. And I'm going to say it depends. I think that the magic number, 8 hours a night gets thrown around a lot. And what's true is that while the majority of people fall somewhere between 7 and 9 hours, we know that sometimes people with chronic illnesses will have higher sleep needs. So it is possible that someone with MS will need 9 or 10 hours of sleep, and that's just your regular, like that's what you need to feel good or good enough during the day. So I think it's very individualized, and that's where sometimes the sleep log can be really helpful in helping us determine what's the right number for you. So I know I'm a monster if I get anything below 7 hours, which is super fun when you have a 9-month-old. And when I get 9 hours or 8.5 hours, I'm like, okay, I feel great. Like this is good. I feel rested. So really, it's kind of experimenting. And with MS, it can vary so much, right? Because of fatigue or relapses sometimes. So I think being really gentle with yourself and acknowledging when you need a little bit of extra sleep. If it becomes a week where you're sleeping your regular hours and you're still tired, it might be good to kind of check in with your provider, making sure that there's nothing else going on.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that, Sam, and thanks for that awesome Q&A session. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then a big thank you to all of our listeners as well this evening. We hope you enjoyed tonight's webinar, but it's not over. Please stay connected with us. You can follow us on any of these social media channels. And again, we've got more coming down the pipe this month. We'd love to see you at a Jumpstart program, your questions answered, which again, Sam will be on. So if we didn't get your question answered this evening, there's your opportunity, October 18th, to join us.
Yep.
And then again, we'll be diving deep into fatigue with a 4-part coaching series. So we'd love to see you for any of those. And please register at cando-ms.org. Lastly, next month, we're going to talk about sex. So how to be your sexual self with MS. That'll be Wednesday, November 2nd. We'll be back to Wednesdays that month. So definitely join us then. And again, for those participating live, you will see a survey pop up just momentarily. So please give us your feedback. It helps us to improve these programs and try to make them better for you. So have a great evening. Again, thank you, Sam. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
Great to see you, and we hope to see the rest of you sometime soon.